Hello, welcome to Lecture 25 of Introduction to Fine Arts. This is the second to last lecture of the course, and the pace of change is happening so fast that we can only hope to touch on most of the important themes here with the time we have left. It's not going to be as complete as I'd like. Consequently, I've added quite a few more links to the course website, and there are plenty of other avenues you can use to explore some of these concepts further. But for now, let's get started. World War II marks the beginning of the time period we're discussing today. And World War II is really World War I Part 2. The fallout from the First War leads to animosities that culminate in yet another world war. Germany is in shambles from the Treaty of Versailles. Its citizens were squeezed by two political extremes that emerged out of a pervasive desperation. One side was Stalin's perverted brand of communists influencing the left, and then there was Hitler's Nazis on the political right. And it really seemed like there was no room for moderation. People eventually went with the homegrown brand of totalitarianism, Hitler's Nazi Party. It takes over, goes on to start blaming scapegoats for all the nation's troubles. Foreigners, Jews, socialists, communists, intellectuals. Maybe among those were, quote, degenerate artists. Hitler himself was an art student, but he wasn't all that successful as an artist. For one thing, he didn't go for that modern stuff, especially the Dada and Expressionism that was popular in Germany at the time. He thought art should be patriotic, and it should extol the virtues of Western tradition. It certainly shouldn't have the nerve to question your own national culture or government, which is what so much of the avant-garde was doing. Hitler restores prosperity and national pride in Germany with a huge military buildup. In the middle part of the 1930s, he begins to flex his military muscles. And then a little later, he invades neighboring countries to create a buffer zone. Looking to the examples provided by previous powers, like the United States, who in the early years of its existence conquered and subjugated millions of people in the name of manifest destiny, even to the point of genocide, Hitler felt that to be a true player on the scene, a country needed elbow room. And to be fair, Germany had a rather precarious geography. So he considered the surrounding countries as part of a greater Germany. He also rounds up and murders Jews, homosexuals, disabled people, all in order to purify the nation. He ends up killing 6 million Jews by the end of the war. Other Europeans were desperate and wanted more than anything else to avoid another great war, and so they appeased Hitler. But if you gave him an inch, he'd take a mile. By the time they realize appeasement isn't going to make the problem go away, it's too late. Leading up to all of this, in 1937, Spain was engulfed in a civil war. The fascist nationalists, led by General Franco, were trying to take over from the democratically elected government. And so Franco asked his ideological buddy in Germany to help him out. Hitler used the opportunity to test out an innovative method of attack, featuring some of his most exciting new toys, aerial bombardment. Aerial bombardment had been around since World War I, but back then it wasn't very effective at all. But by the late 1930s, technology made it deadly on an unimaginable scale. And war would never be the same. Death was even more distant and indiscriminate than when it was delivered through machine guns of World War I. But getting back to the situation at hand. Guernica, Spain was a relatively small town, but they chose to bomb it on market day when people from all over the region would be there. Airplanes came in and dropped a huge amount of explosives. In fact, 3/4 of the town's buildings were completely destroyed, and there's no way to know the number of dead. It's estimated to be up to 3,000 people. Pablo Picasso's Guernica is a huge painting, 11 feet tall, 25 feet wide. Shows the changing style of Picasso, who went through so many different styles in his career, particularly the influence of surrealism on his work, if you look at the time period. But most importantly, it was a response to this bombing, and it becomes an icon of the anti-fascist movement. It depicts terror and chaos, a grieving mother holding a dead baby on the left, stark black and white imagery like newspapers documenting the injustice. Picasso was Spanish, and he was also a communist. He vowed he'd never visit his home until Franco was gone. But Franco and the fascist forces won the Civil War and somehow stayed in place all the way, after the war, all the way until 1970, which seems like a baffling display of Cold War hypocrisy. But anyway, interestingly, Franco never fully joined with Hitler during World War II, despite the ideological fraternity between the two. And since he won and stayed on, Picasso never went back to Spain. Hitler's experiment was a great success. Consequently, strategic bombing became a common activity on both sides during the war, which is a shameful chapter for the Allies as much as it was for the Axis powers. Particularly toward the beginning, Nazi Germany came pretty close to winning the war. By 1942, they had taken over much of Western Europe. All the gray area seen here was under Nazi control then. Only the USSR, in the red, and Britain, in the blue, were left to oppose it. Finally, the USA enters the war after being attacked by a German ally, Japan. And this helps to turn the tide against the Germans, but it's still a long war after that. By the end, there was even more loss of life than in World War I. But also, in a way, it was maybe psychologically a bit less crushing for society as a whole than World War I was. Western civilization had been somewhat desensitized from the First World War. But as the war progresses, the Allies want to do whatever it takes to win. Since war is war, and Allies learn valuable lessons from German air tactics, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And Japan and Germany end up being mercilessly firebombed throughout the war. Firebombing, as it turns out, is an even better bombing technique. The use of incendiary bombs to engulf cities in flames rather than just create impact from the initial blast. The flames all get together and start fires throughout the city, but with the right atmospheric conditions, wind in particular, it creates a firestorm. Intense heat creates a sort of vortex of heat and flame, and the whole city becomes an inferno. The air is literally sucked out of people's lungs from the heat, and they shrivel up as they're torched. Strategic bombing was justified by the theory that it would help end the war sooner by breaking morale of the enemy population, and they in turn would convince their government to surrender. And it would save more lives than it cost by ending the war sooner. And it's enemy lives, so it's not such a big deal. That was sort of the rationalization. The one big problem with that theory, though, is in a totalitarian regime, during a war, how much say do the citizens actually have over what their government does? And just before the end of the war, the Nazis were retreating on all sides, the war in Europe, and US and Britain hit the city of Dresden with a massive firebombing campaign. And this was an important city to Western cultural heritage, all sorts of museums and historic art and architecture were there. And I guess they thought that this will surely break the Germans' will. And the city was left in ruins. It killed well over 20,000 civilians, and many important artworks were destroyed along the way. And worst of all, Germany was ready to surrender anyway. The war in the Pacific between the US and Japan continued a bit longer until atomic bombs were dropped, and that really did end the war, and the nuclear age began. From that point forward, there's been a perpetual sense of unease because of the implications of nuclear weapons. By the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States are the two big superpowers, and they aren't allies anymore. The Cold War lasts from the end of the war, around 1945 till 1991, including proxy wars in places like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. And right after World War II, Europe itself was once again in shambles. But as much as the United States sacrificed in loss of military lives, it was far, far away from the war itself. No United States cities were damaged at all. Plus, the war got the entire nation out of the Great Depression. The economy was booming from the ultimate stimulus package, the military-industrial complex. And artists fled Europe to escape Nazi persecution during the war and to escape the devastation in Europe after the war. And they found a home in the United States, particularly in New York City, which becomes the new center of the art world. Abstract Expressionism was the style, the first truly American contribution to Western art. They were influenced by the newly arrived European mentors. They brought Surrealism, Existentialism, Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a colleague of Sigmund Freud. His most influential concepts included the collective unconscious, which was like the subconscious mind that Freud talked about, only instead of being for an individual, it was for all of humanity, almost like roots that sprout from tree to tree under the ground. It's like this type of unconsciousness was inherited, like part of our DNA, and it linked us all together. He also brought the notion of archetypes, which was a stark rejection of the clean slate theory. Instead, he suggests that humans come into the world with an understanding of universal symbols. And he would say that across all these different cultural divides, you see certain symbols that have a consistent meaning. His ideas were incredibly influential to the abstract expressionists. The term New York School refers to the painters loosely associated who were based in New York working after World War II. Some common characteristics of their work: they tried to reach the unconscious with automatic painting, kind of like Surrealists did. They employed spontaneous action. They dealt with the inner emotions of the artist through mostly non-representational imagery. Their paintings were massive in scale and bold, and they meant to engulf the viewer in visual experience. They also favored the primacy of visual experience rather than the communication of specific subject matter. You can see some similarities with Kandinsky. And they were highly individualistic in their various approaches to creating work. This is when artists stopped signing their works on the front, because everyone had such a unique and distinct style that you knew who painted it because of what the painting was. It was all heroic and brave. It was like the artist against the universe, and very dramatic and very earnest. Abstract Expressionism was championed by an art critic named Clement Greenberg, who called for a complete rejection of illusionism, like making a picture of something. Each medium must define what is pure to itself. For example, painting is a flat surface. It involves the shape of whatever the support is that it's on and the properties of the pigments. That's what painting is. Anything else a painting tries to be is denying its essence and trying to be something it isn't. It's inauthentic, going back to some of the attitudes of the existentialists we talked about before. To Greenberg, a painting shouldn't be a picture of something. It should be its own thing. its own reference point, not a pretend version of something else. This is an overgeneralization, but the abstract expressionists generally fell into two basic camps. The action painters like Willem de Kooning, Lee Krasner, or in this case, Jackson Pollock, and then the color field painters like Helen Frankenthaler or Barnett Newman or Mark Rothko. For the action painters, what was to go on the canvas was not a picture at all, but an event. The artist didn't go to the easel with an image in mind, but with material in hand to do something. And the image would be a result of this encounter. There were many important action painters, but perhaps the most iconic was Jackson Pollock. In around 1947, he changed his working method entirely. He used to paint on easels and was really more like a messy surrealist, maybe you could say. But he began to work in a completely different manner. He started slinging paint from above the canvas, creating an all-over visual texture of arcs and drips, splatters and dribbles. So to do this, he used sticks and brushes and dipped them in the can of paint. But he didn't touch the canvas with them. He just used them to drop the paint from above and sling it around and flick it. And what was left behind consisted of interlocking lines of paint, the evidence of the activity of painting. It was spontaneous, yet in some ways controlled. There was a certain range of actions that he would take. It was very much a physical action. A little bit ago, I said he created an all-over composition. What I mean is that there's no hierarchy of the parts. Your eye flits about the painting. There's no focal point to dictate where your attention goes. It also means that everything hits at once, like a wall of sound. In so many ways, this was a clear rejection of conventional standards, and it envelops the viewer in violent, swirling, interlocking colors. Here's a detail shot, and up close, you can see the weaving splatters of paint stained into the unprimed surface of the canvas. And then this quote by Jackson Pollock. I don't paint nature, I am nature. While Jackson Pollock and the other action painters emphasized the energy of the mark, color field painters sought to dematerialize color. They employed a more tranquil, atmospheric impression that depends on the power of color to communicate. Of all the color field painters, one is especially significant. Mark Rothko was born in Russia and moved to the United States as a child. He started out figuratively, but eventually moved away from representational images altogether. His paintings become more interesting the longer you look at them. In fact, the viewer is more like a collaborator to help the picture perform. Here's an image from the Rothko Chapel in Houston. It's by Rice University. Highly recommend checking it out next time you're in Houston. It's this octagonal shaped structure, and as you walk into it, it's sort of dimly lit. And so if you're coming in from the daylight, you look up at the walls and all you see are these huge black canvases. But if you sit there a little while, your eyes begin to adjust, and these deep burgundy colors start to emerge in the surface, shimmering from just below your conscious awareness. It's the quietest of visual experiences, and it's very, very soft and very, very beautiful. Invariably, some redneck walks in and says, "What the hell is this?" And that's almost part of the piece. It's an extremely quiet, meditative experience that takes patience. but the patience pays off if you sit with it long enough. The color transforms before your eyes, albeit in very subtle ways, and the shimmering rectangles seem to float like a mist in front of the canvas. It can be a deeply moving experience. Not one that's going to bowl you over like a roller coaster, but one that if you really focus, if you really sit and are quiet, you'll know what I mean. Color is primary to expression in these paintings. They usually are 2 or 3 bands of pure color with these indistinct hazy edges, glazed layers painted on top of one another. These rectangles just seem to kind of float, ethereal. He believed that colors could express basic human emotions. He said that if you're moved only by the color relationships, then you miss the point. Color is just a simple expression of a complex thought. He also said the only valid subject matter is tragic and timeless. Like all of the abstract expressionists, the act of making art carries an extreme emotional toil. At some point, maybe that much intensity can't sustain itself. After years of living basically on popcorn so he could afford to paint before finally finding success, truly suffering for your art, Jackson Pollock became a raging alcoholic and died in a car crash. Mark Rothko slits his wrist in the studio. They both met untimely ends. The next generation of American artists embraced a bit more levity in their work. They began to lighten up a little bit. Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns were part of a group of artists we call Neo-Dada. They're somewhat like a bridge between abstract expressionism and pop art that we'll talk about a little later. Their style looked expressive and abstract, but with an entirely more down-to-earth intent. Rauschenberg, who was a bit older and more established of the two of them, was born in Port Arthur, Texas. He was famous for his combines. They fused painting and ready-made sculptural objects put together in strange contextual relationships, hence the phrase Neo-Dada. You can see the connection to what Marcel Duchamp had done. This particular one is called Monogram. An interesting quote from Rauschenberg: "I don't want a picture to look like something it isn't. I want it to look like something it is. And I think a picture is more like the real world when it's made out of the real world." The art critic Jerry Saltz sums up the description of the difference between these two periods. Everything abstract expressionism was, Rauschenberg and company weren't. Ab-X was big, lofty, abstract, and made by older straight men. This neo-dada, proto-pop, and pop art was smaller, cooler, figurative, vernacular, and often made by younger gay men. As Rauschenberg professed, I could never make the language of abstract expressionism work for me. Words like tortured, struggle, and pain, I could never see those qualities in paint. How could red be passion? Red is red. Ding, 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 we've reached a milestone. As far as I know, Jasper Johns is the first artist, at least in the chronology of the class, that we've discussed who's still alive, though he's 90 at the time of this recording. Jasper Johns was friends with benefits, with Rauschenberg for a time, and the energy fueled by their partnership left an indelible mark on the course of art history. Both artists are titans of 20th century art. Legend has it that that Jasper Johns was in fact discovered by an important art dealer while said dealer was supposed to be visiting Rauschenberg to organize a show. The dealer was so entranced by the younger Jasper Johns that he forgot all about the Rauschenberg exhibition. Here we see lush, painterly treatment of simple subject matter. Here he appropriated popular iconography in his work, and he did so on a lot of his pieces. Here's the U.S. flag, which is such a conventional, everyday symbol. but it becomes primarily a visual object instead. He neutralizes the subject through surface and texture. But at the same time, the work also kind of raises some difficult questions. Is it a flag or is it a painting? Does it create a feeling of national pride or reference the stain of imperialism and aggression? So as much as these after act, I hesitate to see neo-Dada, although you can see that's sometimes a pretty good description. But these artists that came along after abstract expressionism, generally more lighthearted, but even in the lightheartedness, there's a sense of sometimes of irony, but of playfulness for sure. Here's a detail shot. The surface is, you can see the encaustic surface a little bit better. It's semi-transparent with impasto marks. Encaustic is a medium of painting that goes back at least as far as the ancient Egyptians, using melted beeswax as a binder for the pigment. It leaves behind a translucence that's mysterious and beautiful. Next, we'll talk very briefly about music created during this period. Although on the course site there are links to more musical works that it would be good to check out. But here, John Cage was a composer friend to John Zen Rauschenberg. It's crazy. This one little geographic location of New York City spawns so much important output. It's crazy. And in our world now where there is no real center to the art world, it's almost unimaginable that almost everything could have happened there. But anyway, he created a lot of pieces, but perhaps his most famous work was one called 4 minutes, 33 seconds. In a way, it kind of builds upon Duchamp's notion that anything can be art if placed in the context of art. He says here that anything can be music when it's in the context of music. 4 minutes, 33 seconds is a composition that involves the sound of the symphony hall and audience members exclusively. It's literally 4 minutes and 33 seconds of stage silence. At its premiere, the pianist sat down, gathered himself, lifted up the cover of the piano, waited the appropriate amount of time, then closed it. He did this once for each movement of the composition. And after just over 4.5 minutes, he got up and left the stage. You can imagine what the audience might have been thinking and doing during the performance. There were sighs and coughs, and whispered conversation. Eventually, there were stomping feet as people had had enough and stormed out of the venue. All of the sounds were left up to chance by the composer. But the piece was entirely earnest, with no intention of the Dada irony that we would have seen with someone like Marcel Duchamp. At least that's how it's often interpreted. In fact, this brings up an interesting aspect of art that begins to enter the consciousness of artists and thinkers at about this point in time. Something we'll refer to as an ism a little later on. As with Jasper John's flag, in some ways there's no real way of discerning the actual intent of the artist here, at least not beyond what they say and taking that at face value. Anyway, I didn't post this particular piece of music on the course site. You can listen to the whole composition yourself at home. Just set the timer on your phone. And that's going to do it for this lecture. We've got one more lecture left, and in that one we're going to talk about pop art, a lot of other isms, and especially the biggest ism, postmodernism. Until then, farewell.